The women of Caldwell Flats had gathered at the station that morning. The way people gather when they expect to watch something go wrong. Meredith Hollis got there first. She always did. 40 years old, sharp-faced, wearing a hat that cost more than most ranch hands earned in a month, she stood on the platform with her two closest friends, Vera Pintz and Augusta Bowman, and she did not pretend to be there for any other reason than to see. "He sent for a woman through a newspaper," Meredith said, loud enough that the station master could hear her from inside his window. "Like ordering a saddle. You get what you pay for." Vera laughed the way small women laugh when they want to sound larger. "He put capable in the advertisement. Not handsome, not refined. Capable." She let the word sit there like a stone dropped in still water. "What kind of man writes that?" "A man who's given up," Augusta said. They were not wrong about everything. Wade Callaway had given up on a few things. He'd given up on sleeping past 4 in the morning. He'd given up on the idea that the north fence would ever stop falling down on its own. He'd given up on supper tasting like anything worth sitting down for. But he hadn't given up on the ranch. And he hadn't given up on the practical belief that a man running 80 acres alone, with 2 ranch hands who were loyal but limited, needed help that he could not hire and could not manufacture out of stubbornness alone. So he had written the advertisement, and he had meant every word of it. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt like the world looked right past you, like your worth was measured in the wrong currency entirely, this story is for you. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that platform. Bochet. The stagecoach was 11 minutes late. Wade knew because he'd checked his watch twice, and then stopped checking it because it made him feel like a fool standing there with a pocket watch in his hand in front of half the town. He put the watch away and looked at the road instead. He was not a man who fidgeted. 38 years old, weathered the way good leather gets weathered. Not ruined, just marked. He stood with his hat in his hands because he'd been raised to take his hat off when meeting someone for the first time. And he was trying to remember that this was still a first meeting, even if it had been arranged through correspondence and a $14 advertisement fee. Hank Brewer stood a few feet behind him. Hank was 52, had worked the Callaway Ranch for 9 years, and had the face of a man who had formed an opinion about most things and saw no reason to revise it. He'd said nothing about the mail order arrangement when Wade first told him, which was its own kind of commentary. Deke Polson stood beside Hank. Deke was younger, 26, and had not yet learned how to keep his face from saying what his mouth hadn't decided on yet. When Wade had announced he was sending for a bride, Deke had looked at the ceiling for a long moment before saying, "Well, that's one way to do it." The stagecoach came around the bend, trailing dust. Wade put his hat back on, then took it off again. The coach stopped. The driver climbed down, opened the door, and a woman stepped out onto the Caldwell Flats platform, and the first thing Wade noticed was that she was small, not delicate. There was nothing delicate about the way she stepped down, putting her full weight on the step, and then her feet flat on the boards without reaching for help. But small. 5'2" maybe. Gray dress, worn at the cuffs. Hair the color of river mud pinned back without ceremony. A carpet bag in one hand and nothing else. She looked up. Her eyes were brown and direct, and she did not smile the way women sometimes smile when they're arriving somewhere nervous. That careful, pleasing smile that's more armor than greeting. She just looked. She found Wade's face in the small crowd, held it for a moment, and then walked toward him with the carpet bag at her side. Behind him, Wade heard Meredith Hollis say something in a voice she did not bother to lower. He didn't catch all of it. He caught plain, and he caught, that's all he could find. He also caught the way Harriet Voss's chin lifted by maybe half an inch. She had heard it too. "Mr. Callaway," she said. Not a question. "Miss Voss?" He shook her hand because it felt like the right thing, and her grip was firm and dry. "Good trip?" "Long," she said. "I'd like water before anything else, if that's possible." "There's a trough at the—" He stopped himself. "I'll get you water from the hotel." "The trough is fine, Mr. Callaway. I'm not fragile." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with those direct brown eyes and did not elaborate. "All right," he said. He turned to lead her toward the wagon, and as he did, he passed close enough to the cluster of women on the platform that he heard Meredith Hollis say, clearly and with the precision of someone making a point, "She looks like she came in on the freight line." He kept walking. He heard Harriet's footsteps behind him, steady and unhurried on the boards. The ride to Callaway Ranch took 40 minutes on a good road. The road to Callaway Ranch was not a good road. It was rutted from spring mud that had dried wrong and never been graded, and the wagon bounced in a way that made conversation feel optional rather than expected. Wade drove. Harriet sat beside him on the bench with the carpet bag between her feet, and for the first 10 minutes neither of them said anything. Wade was not uncomfortable with silence. He spent most of his days in it. But this silence had a texture to it, something waiting inside it, and eventually he felt the obligation to say something useful. "The ranch has been running short," he said. "You should know that before you see it." "Short of what?" "Most things." He kept his eyes on the road. "I lost my wife 3 years back. She kept the house. After she passed, things fell off. The kitchen's it's functional, but it's not what it was." Harriet looked at the road ahead. "What did she die of?" Wade blinked. Most people danced around that question. "Fever. Fast. She was sick 4 days and then she was gone." "I'm sorry," Harriet said. Not the extended, elaborate kind of sorry that people offered when they wanted credit for their sympathy. Just the 2 words. "It was 3 years ago," he said. "Time doesn't really change what a thing was," she said. He looked at her sideways. She was watching a hawk circle over the dry grass to the left of the road. "The advertisement said capable," she said. "Not experienced cook or skilled seamstress. Just capable. Why?" He thought about it. He hadn't thought about it much when he wrote it. It had seemed like the clearest word. "Because I don't know exactly what the ranch needs," he said finally. "It needs a lot of things. I figured capable covered more ground." "It does," she said. "You wrote that you'd managed a household alone," he said. "Your letter mentioned a farm." "My father's farm. He passed 4 years ago. My brother inherited the land and I inherited the work of convincing him he needed to sell before the creditors arrived." She paused. "Which he eventually did. I stayed on until the sale was settled, and then I had to go somewhere." "So this was practical," she said. Not apologetic, not embarrassed. "The same way your advertisement was practical. That seems like a reasonable starting point for 2 people who don't know each other." Wade drove the wagon over a rut that jolted them both and kept his mouth shut for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "Neither are you." He wanted to ask what she had expected, but they were turning through the gate of the ranch then, and whatever she had expected, she would see now. Bates. Callaway Ranch had been a good property once. The land was still good, 83 acres of Colorado foothills, decent water access, shelter from the worst of the north wind by a ridge of pines. The cattle were down to 31 head from a peak of 60, but they were healthy. The barn was solid. The bunkhouse where Hank and Deke slept was drafty but standing. The main house was something else. Wade had not looked at it the way a visitor would look at it in a long time. He'd stopped seeing it around the same time he stopped seeing his wife's chair at the table as her chair and started just seeing it as a chair. But watching Harriet step down from the wagon and face the house, he saw it again. The porch had a board missing. The window on the east side had a crack in it stuffed with rags. The front door hung slightly crooked in its frame from a winter storm that had pulled the top hinge loose. Inside, he knew the kitchen held a stove with a warped plate, a table with 3 mismatched chairs and one that wobbled, shelves that had not been organized since Clara died, and a smell that was not bad exactly, but was the smell of a room where no one spent more time than they had to. Harriet looked at all of it. Her face did not do the thing he dreaded. It did not fall. She did not look like a woman calculating how fast she could get back on a stagecoach. She looked like a woman who had walked into a problem and was already thinking about what part of it to address first. "The kitchen," she said. "Can I see it?" He stopped. "Yes." She picked up her carpet bag and went inside. He stood on the porch for a moment before following her. Bot. Hank and Deke came in from the south pasture around midday. They found Wade on the porch, which was not where Wade usually was at midday, and they exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. "She here?" Hank said. "Inside," Wade said. "Kitchen." Hank looked at the door. "She say anything?" "She asked to see the kitchen." Deke pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. "What'd she think?" "She didn't say." Wade looked at the door, too. "She's been in there 2 hours." Hank's eyebrows moved. 2 hours. "She asked me not to come in." He paused. "She asked if I had a working hammer and some nails." "Did you give them to her?" "I gave her the hammer and nails." Deke looked at Hank. Hank looked at Deke. Both of them looked at the door. "She fixing something?" Deke said. "She's doing something," Wade said. He didn't elaborate because he didn't know more than that. And there was something about admitting that a woman he had met 3 hours ago had more control of his kitchen than he did that he wasn't ready to say out loud. From inside the house came the sound of something being moved, then the sound of the hammer. "She know what she's doing?" Hank said. Wade thought about the way she had walked into the kitchen, stopped in the middle of the room, and turned slowly, looking at the shelves, the stove, the floor, the window, the ceiling, taking inventory of everything without asking what anything was or whether anything worked. Then she had looked at him and said, "Do you have salt? Real salt, not the gritty kind from the bottom of a wet barrel?" He had said he thought there was a good barrel in the cellar. She had said, "Find out." "She knows what she's doing," Wade said. She came out at 4 o'clock. She had taken off her jacket, and her hair had come loose on one side, which she had not bothered to fix. Her sleeves were pushed above her elbows, and there was a grease mark on her left forearm from the stove. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at them, all 3 of them on the porch, where they had migrated at some point without really deciding to, with the expression of someone who has finished a first step and is already calculating the second. "I need to know what you have in the cellar," she said to Wade, "and I mean all of it. Not what you think is there. What's actually there?" "I can show you," he said. "Good." She glanced at Hank and Deke. "You two eat in the main house or the bunkhouse?" Hank's chin went up slightly. "Bunkhouse, usually. We got our own—" "Come to the main house tonight," she said. It was not phrased as a request. 7 o'clock. Hank opened his mouth, closed it. "Miss Voss," Wade said carefully, "the men have their own arrangements." "I'm cooking supper," she said. "It seems like a waste to cook for one." She looked at him with the direct brown eyes. "Unless you eat alone by preference." "No," he said, before he had really thought about it. 7 o'clock, she said again, and went back inside. Deke watched her go. He turned to Wade with an expression that fell somewhere between impressed and alarmed. "She always like that?" he said. "She's been here 6 hours, Wade said. "That's not an answer." Wade turned back toward the door. From inside, he heard her moving again. The sound of a heavy pot being placed on the restored stove, a sound the kitchen had not made in longer than he could count without feeling the ache of counting it. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think maybe." The cellar had more than Wade knew. He had stopped going down there after Clara died because Clara had been the one who kept the cellar organized. Jars labeled in her handwriting, dried herbs hung in bundles from the low beams, root vegetables sorted by type and rotation so nothing went bad before its time. After she was gone, he had gone down twice, found it overwhelming in a way he was embarrassed to name, and started buying what he needed from the Caldwell Flats dry goods store, and not thinking about what was still stored below. Harriet walked down the cellar steps with a lamp and emerged 40 minutes later with a list she had written on the back of a piece of brown paper. "You have dried beans," she said. "2 kinds. You have onions, soft but usable. Salt pork, good. Cornmeal, still good. It's dry enough down there. Lard in a sealed crock. Dried sage and thyme, old but there's still smell in them." She looked at the list. "When did you last bake bread?" "I don't—" He stopped. He couldn't remember. He bought bread from the store. He had stopped thinking of bread as something that was made. "Long time," he said. "There's sourdough starter in a crock at the back. It's been neglected, but it's not dead. Your wife kept it." She held out the list. "This is what I need from the store tomorrow. Tonight I'll work with what's here." He looked at the list. It was not long. He had expected longer. "That's all?" "That's enough," she said. He looked up. "My wife's sourdough starter," he said slowly. She met his eyes without flinching. "I can set it aside if you don't want it used." He thought about that. He thought about a starter that Clara had fed every week for 11 years, that had survived the move from Kansas, that had made the bread that had been at every meal of their marriage, sitting in the back of a dark cellar, going slowly toward nothing. "Use it," he said. She nodded once and went back inside. At 6:45, Hank Brewer told Deke Polson that he was not going up to the main house. "You heard her," Deke said. "I don't take orders from a woman I never met before sundown," Hank said. He was sitting on his bunk pulling off his boots. "Wade can eat with his bride. That's not my affair." She said, "I know what she said." Hank set one boot on the floor with a definitive sound. "She came in here today, and inside 6 hours she's running meals like she owns the place. That's not how it works." Deke looked at the door. From the direction of the main house, something was moving through the evening air that was hard to ignore. He couldn't have named what it was, not exactly, but it reached through the bunkhouse walls, and it did something to the space between his ribs. "Hank," he said. "No." "You smell that?" Hank was quiet for a moment. The evening air carried it clearly now. Bread, baking, not the flat, bought kind. The kind that started from something alive. Yeast and heat and waiting. The kind that meant someone had been working toward this moment for hours before you ever knew you were hungry. And underneath the bread, something with onions and salt pork. Something that had been simmering. Something that smelled like a meal instead of just food. Hank sat with his boot in his hand for a long moment. 7 o'clock, you said? He said. 6:58 now, Deke said. Hank put his boot back on. The table was set. Not in any elaborate way. Wade did not own elaborate things. But the mismatched chairs had been arranged evenly. The wobbling one had a folded piece of sacking under its short leg, and the surface of the table had been scrubbed down to wood that Wade had forgotten was that particular warm color underneath the grime. There was a lamp in the center. There were 4 plates, which meant Harriet had found the good plates Clara had put away in the high cabinet, the ones Wade had stopped looking at. There were 4 spoons and 4 forks, all polished with something until they caught the lamplight. Harriet herself stood at the stove in a fresh apron. She had brought one in the carpet bag, which was either practical or alarming depending on how you looked at it, and she was moving between 2 pots with the ease of someone who had done this in harder kitchens than this one. Wade sat at his usual chair. Hank stood in the doorway for a moment. Deke was behind him, trying to look like he hadn't walked fast. "Sit down," Harriet said without turning around. "Bread needs another minute." Hank looked at the table. He looked at the plates and the polished spoons and the folded sacking under the wobbling chair leg. He sat down. The bread came out. It was a round loaf, imperfect on one side where the heat from the stove was uneven. She had not been shy about pointing this out before anyone else could, dropping it on a wooden board in the center of the table and saying, "The stove runs hot on the right. I'll compensate tomorrow," as if there were already a tomorrow built into the plan. She served the beans and the salt pork from a pot that had been going since early afternoon. She set down a dish of onions cooked slow and dark in the little bit of lard. She sat down herself, pulled her napkin into her lap, and looked at them. They ate. For the first 2 minutes, the only sounds were spoons and the occasional shift of a chair. Then Deke tore a piece of bread and put it in his mouth and stopped moving entirely for a moment. "That's," he started. "Sourdough," Harriet said. "Needs 2 more feedings before it's where it should be, but it still has the taste." Wade had not touched his bread yet. He was looking at it. Clara's starter. Something she had made and tended and brought with them from Kansas in a cold crock wrapped in flannel so it wouldn't die in the February wagon bed. He picked up the bread and ate it. The taste was not hers. Not exactly. Clara's hands had known this bread in a way that couldn't be transferred, couldn't be written in a recipe or carried in memory. But the bones of it were there, the sourness, the crust, the weight of it. He put the bread down and looked at the far wall. "You all right?" Harriet said. She said it quietly, without performance. "Fine," he said. "It's good bread." She looked at him for a moment and then let it go, and he was grateful for that. For the not pushing, for the reading of a room that said, "This is not the time," and then simply not making it the time. Hank had eaten 3 pieces of bread before he said anything. When he finally spoke, it was not an apology. Hank Brewer was not built for apologies, but it was something adjacent to one. "I said something this morning," he said. He kept his eyes on his plate. "About the advertisement, about the word." He cleared his throat. "I said capable was a sad word for a man to put in a paper when he was looking for a wife." Harriet said nothing. She waited. "I was wrong about that," Hank said. He picked up his spoon. "Capable's a fine word." Harriet reached for the bread. "Thank you, Hank," she said. And that was all she said. Across the table, Deke was scraping the last of the beans from the pot and trying to look like he wasn't paying close attention to any of this. After supper, Wade washed the plates. He did not usually wash plates. He usually left them until morning or during certain periods of the last 3 years, until necessity made it unavoidable. But tonight he went to the basin and washed them, and Harriet dried them, and neither of them said much while they did it. "You fixed the stove plate," he said, bent flat again with the hammer. "It'll need a proper replacement eventually, but it'll hold for now." "The shelves in the cellar," he said. "She used to—" He stopped. "They were still labeled," Harriet said. "I could tell where things were supposed to go." He handed her a plate, and she dried it and set it on the shelf. The right shelf, the one Clara had always used, though there was no way she could have known that from the label. "It's not going to be easy," he said. He meant the ranch, or maybe all of it. "No," she agreed. "I didn't expect it to be. When I saw you at the station, I wasn't certain." He said it because it was true, and because she was the kind of person that false certainty would insult. "About whether this was the right decision." She set a spoon in the drawer. "I know," she said. "I could see it on your face." He turned to look at her. She was drying the last pot, not looking at him. "Was I that obvious?" "You were trying not to be. That's what made it obvious." She set the pot on the shelf. "I wasn't certain either. About you. About this place." She folded the drying cloth. "But supper was a good sign." "Of what?" She turned to face him, and her eyes were direct and without softness, which was not the same as without warmth. "That there's still something here worth feeding," she said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the Colorado night had come down full, and the temperature had dropped the way it dropped in September, fast and without negotiation. Through the single window, the lamplight caught the porch boards, and just beyond them, the dark. 7 o'clock tomorrow, Harriet said. Same arrangement. "I'll let the men know," he said. She picked up her lamp and walked toward the narrow room at the back of the house that had been the spare room and was now hers, and he stood in the kitchen after she left and looked at the clean plates on the shelves and the pot hanging back in its proper place and the faint smell of bread still in the air. He had not felt the ranch as a home in 3 years. He wasn't ready to call it that yet. But something had shifted in the weight of the walls, in the way the lamp threw its circle of light, and he stood in it for a long minute before he put out the lamp and went to bed. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and the ranch was quiet, and somewhere under the house in the cellar, in a crock at the back of a dark shelf, something that had been left for dead was slowly coming back to life. The morning after a good meal is a test. Wade had learned that years ago, not from any wisdom someone passed down to him, but from watching what happened on the ranch when something went better than expected. Men relaxed in ways that made them careless, or they tightened, suspicious that the good thing was a loan that would be collected. Either way, the morning after always told you more about people than the event itself had. He was up at 4:15, which was usual, and he came into the kitchen expecting to find it empty, which was also usual, and instead found Harriet standing at the stove in the dark with a lamp on the shelf and a pot of water already coming to heat. She had her back to him. She did not turn around when he came in, though she clearly heard him. "Coffee's not ready," she said. 10 minutes. He stopped in the doorway. "You don't need to see. I'm awake anyway." She turned then, just slightly, to pull a cloth from the shelf. "I don't sleep past 4. Never have." He sat down at the table. He was not sure what else to do. This was his kitchen, and yet the situation had rearranged itself so thoroughly overnight that walking to the stove himself felt like interrupting something. "The starter," she said. "I fed it last night before I went to bed, and again just now. It's responding. Already. It wasn't as far gone as I thought." She glanced at the crock on the back shelf, the one she had brought up from the cellar. "Something kept it. The temperature down there is steady, cold enough to slow it, not cold enough to kill it." She paused. "Your wife knew what she was doing." Wade did not answer that immediately. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. "She knew what she was doing with most things," he said. Harriet poured water into the coffee tin and set it back on the stove. "What was her name?" "Clara." "How long were you married?" 12 years. She nodded, not with sympathy exactly, but with the kind of acknowledgement that says, "I'm taking account of this." And then she turned back to the stove and did not press further, and he found himself grateful for that, in the same way he had been grateful for it the night before. The coffee came. She set a cup in front of him and took her own to the other end of the table and sat down with a piece of paper she had been writing on. Her list, longer than yesterday's, with notes in the margins and handwriting that was small and precise. "I want to see the whole ranch today," she said. "Not the parts you'd show a visitor, all of it. There's no—" He stopped. "The north fence is down in 2 places. I know about fences." She did not say it to impress him. She said it the way you'd say "I know about weather," as a fact, not a credential. "The root garden's gone to nothing," he said. 3 years, I couldn't—" He stopped again. "I figured," she said. She made a note on her paper. "How's the water?" "Creek runs good through September. After that, we rely on the well and the storage tank. Tank needs the seal replaced on the south side." She wrote that down too. "You're making a list," he said. "I'm making several lists," she said, not looking up. "One for what needs doing now, one for what needs doing before winter, one for what I need from town." She turned the paper over. "And one for what I don't understand yet, so I know what to ask." He drank his coffee and watched her write and thought about the fact that in 12 years of marriage, he had never had a conversation like this at 4:30 in the morning, which was not a criticism of Clara. Clara had been many things, and he had loved her for all of them, but was simply a recognition that Harriet Voss was a different species of woman than he had ever had to reckon with. "You ready to walk?" she said, folding the paper. "I haven't finished my coffee." "Bring it," she said, and stood up. Whoa. They walked the whole 83 acres. It took most of the morning. Harriet walked fast for a small woman, and she stopped often, but not to rest. She stopped to crouch and look at soil, to press her thumb against a fence post to test for rot, to stand at the edge of the dead garden and look at it for a long, silent moment before pulling up a handful of dirt and turning it in her fingers. "Ground's still good," she said. "It hasn't gone sour, just neglected." She dropped the dirt. "How long was the garden planted before it stopped?" 9 years, Wade said. She dusted her hands on her skirt. "Soil with 9 years of cultivation doesn't forget fast. We can bring it back by spring if we start now." "It's September," which is why I said now. He had started to say something and stopped twice already during the walk, started to tell her she was moving too fast, that she didn't understand how many hours a day were already spoken for on a working ranch, that Hank and Deke had their own work and couldn't be redirected every time she had a new project. But both times he had stopped himself, because both times he had watched her and seen that she was not making plans the way someone makes plans when they want to appear capable. She was making plans the way someone makes plans when they have already decided that failure is not a comfortable option. At the north fence, she found the 2 places he'd mentioned and a third he hadn't noticed. 3, she said. "I see it." "I can reset the post on the east break," she said. "The other 2 you'll need Hank." He looked at her. "You can set a fence post." She looked back at him with the expression of someone choosing not to say, "I already told you I wasn't fragile." "My father's farm had 200 feet of fence that needed resetting every spring," she said. "I did most of it after he got sick." She moved on along the fence line. "I'm not trying to do Hank's job. I'm telling you what I can handle so you can use him somewhere more useful." That was the moment Hank Brewer chose to appear, riding up on the gray mare from the direction of the south pasture with his hat tipped against the morning sun. He pulled up when he saw them at the north fence. He looked at the third break. Then he looked at Harriet. "You find that?" he said. "This morning," she said. He turned to Wade. "I walked this fence Thursday." "I know," Wade said. Hank swung down from the horse. He walked over to the break and crouched, the way Harriet had crouched in the garden, and looked at the post. "It's the freeze and thaw," he said, almost to himself. "Ground's moving under it." He stood up and looked at Harriet again, with the look of someone revising a position they weren't ready to publicly revise. "You said you can take the east break. If someone can spare a post and a driver—" He was quiet for a moment. "I'll bring them around after I check the cattle water." He got back on the horse without saying anything further and rode back the way he had come. Wade watched him go. "He doesn't say much," Harriet said. "He says enough," Wade said. "What he just said was that he's reconsidering you." She looked after the gray mare. "I know," she said. "I've been reconsidered before." She picked up her paper from where she'd tucked it in her apron pocket. "What's the arrangement with the cattle? I want to understand the whole picture, not just the house." By noon, she had filled both sides of her paper and started on a second sheet. By mid-afternoon, she had helped Hank reset the east fence post. Wade had been ready to step in twice, and both times she had been a step ahead of him, holding the post level while Hank drove it, with a grip that didn't waver even when he swung hard. And by the time the light started to angle low and gold, she was back in the kitchen with her sleeves up and 3 things going at once on the stove. Deke came in for water and stopped in the doorway. "You need help?" he said. He said it the way young men say it when they hope the answer is no, because they're not sure what helping would look like, but they feel bad about not asking. "Can you get me the onion basket from the cellar?" she said without turning around. He went. He came back with the basket. He stood in the doorway again. "Anything else?" "Sit down," she said. "You look like you've been standing since morning." He sat at the table. He watched her work for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said, which was not quite the same as yes, but was not a no either. "Did you know what you were getting into?" he said. "When you answered the advertisement, did you know it was going to be like this?" She turned the thing in the pan. "Like what?" He thought about how to say it. "Hard," he said finally. "I mean, it's not—" He looked at the table. "Mr. Callaway's a fair man. Don't misread me. But the ranch is in a state, and the town already—" He stopped. "Already what?" He was quiet. "You mean what happened at the station," she said. "I wasn't there," he said quickly. "I heard about it. Hank told me what those women said." She moved to the next pot. "What women say has never been the most dangerous thing in a room," she said. "It's when they stop saying anything that you need to worry." He looked at her back. You're not upset about it." "I didn't say that." She turned now and looked at him directly. "I said it wasn't the most dangerous thing." She turned back to the stove. "Being dismissed is only fatal if you believe the people dismissing you." She paused. "Now, onion basket." He handed her the basket. She took 3 onions out, set the basket on the shelf, and started peeling without looking at him again. He sat at the table for another few minutes, not sure why he was still there, and then figured out it was because the kitchen smelled like something was about to become a meal, and that smell, after months of bunkhouse food and grudging suppers, had him rooted to the spot like a dog near a cook fire. "You can stay if you're not in the way," she said, as if she had read the decision in him. He stayed. That evening's supper was better than the first. That bothered Hank Brewer in a way he couldn't immediately account for. The first supper he'd been able to tell himself was luck. She'd had a good cellar to work with, and the surprise of it had made it taste better than it was. But the second night, when she put down a pot of beans that had been cooking low since before noon, with the salt pork and the onions cooked into them until the whole thing had become one thing instead of 3 separate things. And the bread was already better because she had fed the starter twice more, and it had risen properly this time. When all of that was on the table and he was eating it, he ran out of arguments. He had formed his opinion of Harriet Voss between the moment he heard about the advertisement and the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, which was to say he had formed it from nothing. And the opinion had been unflattering, and he had not kept it to himself, which he was beginning to understand had been a miscalculation of the kind a man did not easily recover from in his own estimation. He ate. He didn't say much. After the meal, when Harriet stood and started to clear the plates, he reached across the table and took 2 of them himself. She looked at him. "I can carry plates," he said, with the aggressive dignity of a man performing an apology without calling it one. "Thank you," she said, in the same tone she had used the night before. 2 words. Level, without irony or performance. Wade saw it. He said nothing. After the dishes, Hank went back to the bunkhouse, and Deke followed him, and Wade was left in the kitchen again with Harriet, who was wiping down the table and making notes on her paper with a stub of pencil. "Town?" she said. "I need to go Thursday. I'll take you. I can go alone if you have work." "I'll take you," he said again. She wrote something on her paper. He watched her write. "Those women," he said. "Meredith Hollis and her crowd. They'll be there." She did not look up. "They'll be most places I go, at first." "It doesn't bother you." "I said it bothered me," she said, with the particular patience of someone correcting something for the second time. "I didn't say it stopped me." He was quiet for a moment. "Claire used to say that Meredith Hollis only needed a target," he said, "that it wasn't personal. It was just that she needed somewhere to aim." He paused. "I never found that especially comforting." Harriet looked up from her paper. It was the first time she had seen him say his wife's name without the walls going up behind his eyes. "Clara sounds like she understood people," Harriet said. "She was better at it than me." He looked at the wall. "I tend to take things at face value." "There's nothing wrong with that," she said. "Meredith Hollis would say the advertisement was—" He stopped. "She made a remark. At the station." "I heard it." He looked at her. "And?" She set the pencil down. "And she's a woman who has decided that her own worth depends on other women being worth less. That's a miserable way to live." She picked up the pencil again. "I can't fix that. I'm not responsible for it. What I'm responsible for is what happens at this ranch." She made another note. "Which is what I'm focused on." He sat with that for a moment. "You're going to need to come to the harvest gathering," he said. "Second week of October. The whole county turns out. You'll meet everyone at once." She did not look up from the paper. "That doesn't sound like a concern. That sounds like an opportunity." "Meredith Hollis organizes it." Harriet's pencil stopped moving for just a moment. Then it moved again. "Of course she does," she said without inflection. "What does she need for it?" "Food, mostly. Everyone brings something." "What does the ranch usually bring?" He thought about it. Since Clara died, they had contributed money to the shared table because it was easier than cooking, and he had not been ashamed about that because it was the truth. "Money for the supply table," he said. "Last 2 years." Harriet set the paper down. She looked at him with the look she got when she was making a decision that was already made. "We'll bring food this year," she said. Thursday came gray and cold, with a wind off the ridge that meant the temperature would drop further before noon. Wade brought the wagon around at 8. Harriet came out in the same gray dress, but with a better coat over it. He hadn't seen the coat before, which meant it had been in the carpet bag, which was becoming a document of her priorities. Coat, apron, pencil, paper, everything else secondary. She had a list. She had 2 lists. The road to Caldwell Flats was bumpy and cold, and they sat on the wagon bench with the wind in their faces and a horse named Garnet between the traces, who had strong opinions about her pace and did not respond well to being hurried. "How'd she get that name?" Harriet asked, looking at the horse. "Clara named her. She had red hair when she was a foal, faded out." He clicked his tongue at Garnet, who ignored him. "She's stubborn." "Most things that know their own mind are." Harriet held her coat closed with one hand. "What do people in town know about me?" "What have they heard?" "That you came from Iowa, that you answered an advertisement, that you're—" He stopped. "Plain," she said. He didn't answer. "I know what they said at the station, Wade." It was the first time she had used his given name, and neither of them remarked on it, but it sat in the air between them like a changed thing. "I'm not asking you to apologize for it. I'm asking what they've heard so I know what I'm walking into." He thought about it honestly. "They've heard that you took over the kitchen," he said. "Hank mentioned it at the feed store Wednesday." He went to town without telling me? He goes every Wednesday for the grain. She made a small sound. What did he say exactly? Exactly. As close as you can get. He thought back. He said the new woman at the ranch could cook something out of nothing, and she reset a fence post, and she didn't take any softening of the truth from anyone. Harriet was quiet for a moment. That's not a bad reputation to have. Meredith Hollis heard it through Augusta Bowman by Wednesday afternoon, he said. I don't know what she did with it. I'd guess she sharpened it, Harriet said. Made it sound like a threat. A woman who doesn't need soft treatment is a threat to people who rely on softening things. The outskirts of Caldwell Flats appeared through the gray morning. A cluster of buildings, a church with a wooden spire, the dry goods store with its painted sign faded to the point where you had to already know what it said. Garnet picked up her pace entering town, which was the one context in which she showed any enthusiasm. If she says something today, Harriet said, don't step in front of it. Harriet, I mean it. She looked at him. If you defend me before I've had the chance to speak for myself, it will follow me. Let me handle it. He looked at her for a moment. He was not accustomed to being told to step back. He was not sure he liked it. All right, he said. They pulled up in front of the dry goods store. Meredith Hollis was there. Of course she was. She was always where she could see, which happened to coincide with being where she could be seen, and the Caldwell Flats dry goods store on a Thursday morning was both. She was standing at the fabric counter with Augusta Bowman when Wade and Harriet came in, and she turned with the particular smoothness of someone who has rehearsed for exactly this moment. Mr. Callaway, she said, in a warm voice that did not include Harriet, we've been wondering how you were settling in. The harvest gathering is 3 weeks off, you know. We'll need to know if you're contributing to the table this year, or we're bringing food, Harriet said. Meredith turned to her as if noticing her for the first time, which was a performance so practiced it had become second nature. Mrs. Callaway, she said, with the slight pause before the title that suggested she found it provisional. Miss Voss, Harriet said, we aren't married yet. She said it without embarrassment, as a factual correction. Meredith blinked. That was not the answer she had anticipated. Augusta Bowman made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, or might have been something else. Well, Meredith said, recovering, I suppose a plain arrangement for a practical marriage. She touched the fabric on the counter. We always appreciate whatever people can manage to bring to the gathering. Nothing too elaborate necessary. A simple pan of something would be... What does the gathering need most? Harriet said. Meredith stopped. From the food side, Harriet continued, what's usually short? What do people always run out of first? There was a brief silence. Meredith had clearly not expected to be asked a logistical question. Bread, Augusta said from behind her, with the guilty expression of someone who had not meant to answer but couldn't stop themselves. We always run out of bread. And pies, but bread first. I'll bring bread, Harriet said. She turned to the counter where the store owner, a small man named Garrett Peel, was watching the whole exchange with the fixed expression of someone choosing not to have an opinion. Mr. Peel, I have a list. She put the paper on the counter. Meredith Hollis looked at Wade. Wade looked at Garrett Peel's inventory shelves. He had been told not to step in front of anything, and he was keeping that promise with some effort. She's very... Meredith said to him in a lowered voice, as if Harriet were not 4 feet away. Efficient, Wade said. Meredith pressed her lips together. She turned back to the fabric counter. Augusta Bowman watched Harriet read through her list with Garrett Peel, and her expression had changed from what it had been when they walked in. It was the expression of someone revising an expectation, not with eagerness, but with the involuntary honesty of someone who has received information they had not wanted. They loaded the wagon with the supplies. Harriet checked each item against her list before it went into the bed of the wagon, which made it take longer but meant nothing was left out. On the way home, with Garnet moving at her own determined pace and the wind still cold off the ridge, Wade said, That went better than I expected. Meredith Hollis is not finished, Harriet said. She was looking at the road. I know. She'll have something to say about the bread at the gathering, some reason it's not right, or not enough, or done wrong. She pulled her coat tighter. She's going to need something to win. You could let her have something small, he said. People like her, sometimes they just need— No, Harriet said. She said it without heat, which was worse than if she had been angry. I will not feed her something small to keep the peace. The peace built on that kind of feeding is a debt that compounds. She turned to look at him. I've done that before. At home, with my brother, with the creditors, with every person who thought my compliance was something they were owed. She turned back to the road. I'm not doing it again. He drove. After a minute, he said, What are you going to bring to the gathering? The best bread I know how to make, she said, and 3 pies. 3 pies. Apple, if you have any trees. Do you have any trees? 2, in the south corner. Old, but they still bear. She nodded. Apple, then, and whatever else the seller has for the 3rd. She opened her second list and looked at it. The garden's a bigger problem. We need to start turning it this week if we want any root vegetables worth harvesting. He looked at her with the side of his attention he could spare from the road. You're planning for winter, he said. We've known each other 5 days. She looked at him directly. What else would I plan for? He didn't have an answer. This is where I live now, she said. Her voice was level and without sentiment, but it held something inside it. Not dramatic, not emotional, just settled. The voice of someone who has made a decision and stopped looking back at it. And what I do with where I live is make it work. For me and for the people in it. She folded the list. You wrote that advertisement looking for capable. I am what capable actually looks like. It's not always comfortable. Wade said nothing. Garnet took them around the bend that led back toward the ranch, and the main house came into view through the gray trees. The crooked door, the patched window, the porch with the missing board. And Wade had been looking at it for 3 years as a failure, as evidence of everything he'd lost the ability to maintain, and now for some reason he looked at it and thought instead about what it could be. A thought that arrived not dramatically, but just as a fact, the way the morning arrived, or the cold, without announcement. He didn't say any of that. He had not yet developed the language for it. But he sat on the bench of the wagon with the wind in his face and the ranch coming toward him and a woman beside him who had told him that this was where she lived now, and he drove them home. That night, after the supper things were done, Deke found the missing porch board in the barn where it had been sitting since March, and he brought it out and nailed it back in place without being asked or telling anyone he was doing it. He finished, tried the board with his boot, and went back to the bunkhouse. Harriet saw it from the kitchen window. She did not say anything about it. But the next morning, she made extra biscuits and left a cloth over them on the table near the back door, and when Deke came in for water, they were there, and he ate 3 of them, standing at the counter without saying anything either. Some things in the repair of a broken place happen without needing to be named, which is not the same as not being real. It is, in fact, the most real kind of progress there is, the kind that moves without announcement and holds without ceremony, one small choice at a time. The sourdough starter sat in its crock on the back shelf, fed and ready. Outside, the garden waited for the turning of the ground. 3 weeks out, the harvest gathering waited for bread. And Meredith Hollis, in her house in Caldwell Flats, with her hat that cost more than a month's ranch wages, had not yet decided what she was going to do about Harriet Voss. But she had definitely started thinking about it. The garden did not turn itself. Harriet had known it wouldn't, and she had not expected it to, but there was a difference between knowing a thing would be hard and standing in front of it at 6 in the morning with a spade in your hand and the ground half frozen from a cold night, looking at 4 years of neglect that had gone to weeds and compacted clay and whatever the deer had decided to contribute over the seasons. She started at the near end and worked toward the back fence. Wade found her there an hour later when he came out to check on the cattle water. He stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, watching her drive the spade into the ground, turn it, break the clod, move forward. You started without telling anyone, he said. I told you Thursday I wanted to start this week, she said without stopping. This is the week. He looked at the amount she had turned. It was not nothing, maybe a quarter of the first row, but the garden was long and the ground was arguing back. I'll get the larger fork from the barn, he said. She looked up. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He was already walking toward the barn. He came back with the larger fork and started on the row beside hers, and they worked in the quiet of a cold October morning, which is a particular kind of quiet, not peaceful exactly, but purposeful, the sound of tools and earth and their own breathing and nothing else needing to be said. Hank came out around 8, saw them both in the garden, and went back to the barn. He returned with a second spade. He did not ask which row he should take. He took the far row and started at the back and worked toward them. And nobody remarked on this arrangement because it didn't need remarking on. By the time Deke finished the morning cattle check and wandered over, 3 of the 4 main rows were turned, and Harriet was on her knees at the end of the first row with a handful of dirt, smelling it. Deke stood at the edge. "You smell the dirt?" "I'm checking the quality," she said. "Come here." He crouched beside her. She handed him a handful of the turned earth. "What do you smell?" He smelled it. He looked uncertain. "Dirt?" "Under that." He tried again. He shook his head. "Nothing bad," she said. "No sourness, no rot. It smells like ground that's been sleeping, not ground that's been sick." She dropped her handful. "We can work with this." Deke looked at the turned rows. "You're going to plant something in October. Garlic goes in now. Kale can still take. Some of the root vegetables if we mulch heavy." She brushed her hands on her apron. "And we're preparing for spring. Soil that's been turned in fall is different in spring, looser, warmer underneath." "You know a lot about this," he said. "I grew up in dirt," she said. It was not self-pity. It was not pride. It was just the simple fact of her. The harvest gathering was on a Saturday. In the week between the shopping trip and the gathering, the kitchen at Callaway Ranch ran at a pace that had not been seen since Clara was alive, and possibly not even then. Harriet baked through Thursday and Friday. The sourdough, which had now been properly fed and revived and was producing loaves with a crust that made a sound when you tapped it, 4 rounds of it, enough to fill a washboard with cooling loaves. And on Friday afternoon she started the pies. The apple trees in the south corner had given up enough fruit for 2 full pies with a little left over for a small one, which she made into a deep dish that did not look as good as the others but would taste the same. The third pie she made from dried apricots from the cellar, reconstituted and spiced with the sage that was old but still had smell in it and a little of the brown sugar she had bought in town. Wade came into the kitchen on Friday evening and stopped. The table held 4 loaves of bread and 3 pies, and the smell in the room was the kind of smell that does something to your chest before your brain has had time to form a thought about it. "You baked all day," he said. "I baked most of yesterday, too." She was at the stove cleaning the last pan. "The bread is for the table. The pies are to be cut and served." 3 pies is more than we need," he said, and then immediately understood from her expression that he had said the wrong thing. "It's exactly what we need," she said. "We're not bringing what we need. We're bringing what the gathering needs." She set the pan on the shelf. "There's a difference." He looked at the table. "Meredith Hollis will have something to say about this." "I'm counting on it." He looked at her. "Harriet." "Wade." She turned to face him with the same calmness she brought to fence posts and turned soil. The woman said what she said at the station in front of the whole town. She said what she said at the dry goods store. She has decided I am a target. I cannot stop that decision. She folded the towel in her hands with a precision that was not about the towel. What I can do is make it expensive for her to be wrong about me. He stood in the kitchen with the smell of bread and pie in the air and looked at the woman who had arrived at his ranch 12 days ago with a carpet bag and thought about the advertisement he had placed that said capable in it and thought about how insufficient that word was and how accidentally accurate. "All right," he said. "Go." The gathering was held on the Merchant's Flat south of town, a wide-open field that Caldwell Flats used for every outdoor occasion large enough to require one. By the time Wade's wagon pulled up, there were already 40 people there, and the long tables were half covered in dishes. Harriet stepped down from the wagon with the first 2 loaves and the instruction to Wade and Deke to handle the rest carefully. She had worn her gray dress, which was the dress she had arrived in. She had been in the wagon the night before, taking 2 inches off the hem and re-sewing it and ironing it with the flat iron heated on the stove. It was still a gray dress, and it was still the dress she had arrived in, but it fit better now. She walked to the food table. She did not look around to see who was watching. She had made a decision about that before she climbed off the wagon. She would do what she had come to do and let other people manage their own looking. She set the bread. Augusta Bowman was at the table arranging a dish of pickled things when Harriet set the first 2 loaves down. She stared at them for a moment. She reached out and pressed the crust with one finger, and it gave slightly and sprang back in the way that good bread does. "Did you make this?" Augusta said. "This morning," Harriet said. "This morning." Augusta repeated it like she was making sure she had it right. Wade and Deke came up with the other loaves and the 3 pies and set them at the end of the table, and by the time everything was arranged, a small cluster of women had gathered at this end of the table in the way that people gather around something interesting while trying to appear as though they have gathered for unrelated reasons. Vera Pence was among them. She looked at the bread with an expression that she worked hard to make neutral and did not entirely succeed. "The ranch has been busy," she said to Wade, who was standing nearby and had forgotten Harriet's instruction to let things play out. "Miss Voss has been working," he said, which was true, and was also a slight correction of Vera's implication that the bread might have assembled itself. Vera looked at the pies. 3 pies. "Apple and apricot," Harriet said, coming up beside Wade. "The apricots are from the cellar, dried from last year." "Your cellar?" Vera said, with a note in it. "Clara Callaway's cellar," Harriet said, without hesitation. "She kept it well. There's still good stock in it." She looked at Vera directly. She knew what she was doing. The name landed in a particular way among the women who had known Clara, which was most of them. It was the right name to say because it was true, and because it gave Clara the credit she was owed, and because it did not pretend that Harriet had arrived at the ranch to erase what was there before. Vera was quiet. Meredith Hollis arrived 40 minutes after everyone else, which was a timing choice, not an oversight. She moved through the gathering with the ease of a woman who had organized it and wanted everyone to feel that ease as a form of authority. She reached the food table. She looked at the bread. She looked at the pies. She looked at Harriet, who was standing at the far end of the table talking to a woman named Ruth Draper, who ran the schoolroom and who had asked Harriet something about the sourdough process with the genuine interest of someone who had been trying to start their own for 2 years without success. Meredith approached. She did not say anything about the food directly. She had learned long ago that direct comments could be answered, and answered well by someone who was paying attention. She preferred the approach from the side. "I didn't expect you to contribute this year," she said to Wade, who was standing 2 feet from Harriet. "The last 2 years, the ranch just—" "Miss Voss organized the table contribution," Wade said. He said it neutrally, but clearly. Meredith turned to Harriet. "My goodness, 4 loaves." She touched one with a single finger. "And pies. I hope you didn't wear yourself out, dear. The ranch must keep you very busy just settling in." Harriet finished her sentence to Ruth Draper about maintaining humidity in the starter crock and then turned to Meredith with the patience of someone who had already mapped this conversation before it started. "The ranch does keep me busy," she said, "but bread keeps while you're busy with other things. That's the virtue of it." She looked at the table. "Will there be enough people to get through it? I didn't want to underbring." Meredith's smile thinned. "I'm sure it'll be adequate." "But the apricot pie might be the one people are least sure of," Harriet said, as if she were thinking out loud. "Dried fruit can be uncertain, but if you'd like to taste it before the serving starts, to make sure it's suitable for the table." "That's my job," Meredith said, and the word job came out with more sharpness than she intended, because she had been offered a role and stepped into it before recognizing the invitation. "Yes," Harriet said, "I thought it might be." Ruth Draper made a sound in her throat that she converted into a cough. Meredith picked up a small piece of the apricot pie. Harriet had cut a sliver before they left the ranch, in anticipation of exactly this kind of handling, and tasted it. Her face did the thing faces do when they receive information they had not hoped for. It did not fall apart. Meredith Hollis had excellent control of her face, but something moved behind her eyes. "It's acceptable," she said. "Good," Harriet said with complete sincerity. "I'll take the rest and cut it for serving." The afternoon went the way harvest gatherings go when the weather holds and the food is good. Slowly, with the ease of people who have been working hard and are grateful for an afternoon that requires nothing of them except their company. Children ran in the far field. Men stood in loose clusters and talked about water and cattle prices. Women moved between the table and the blankets spread on the grass. Harriet cut bread. She cut pies. She answered questions because people asked them. A woman named Nella Suthurst, whose husband ran a sheep operation on the far side of the ridge, came back for a second slice of the apple pie and said, outright and without decoration, "I haven't had bread like this since my mother." Harriet said, "Clara Callaway's sourdough starter. It's a good one." And Nella Suthurst looked at her with a kind of appraisal that had moved past the cursory stage. "You're keeping her starter." "It's a waste to let a good thing die when it doesn't have to," Harriet said. Nella Suthurst went back to her blanket with her second slice of pie and said something to the woman beside her, and the woman looked at Harriet once, briefly, and then looked away and nodded. That was how reputations actually moved in a small county. Not through announcements, not through confrontation, through Nella Suthurst going back for a second slice of apple pie and saying 4 words to the woman beside her. Wade saw it. He was standing with a group of ranchers near the far edge of the gathering, but he watched Harriet from the distance with a kind of attention that he was not organizing or directing. It was just there, an awareness, the way you become aware of weather before you consciously register that the sky has changed. Hank appeared beside him. "She's working the table," Hank said. "She's cutting bread," Wade said. "That's not all she's doing." Hank had a cup of cider and was looking at the table from a distance. "Watch who comes back twice." Wade watched. Nella Suthurst had been back twice. So had 2 other women whose names he didn't know well, newcomers from the north end of the county. Ruth Draper had been back 3 times and was now standing near Harriet with the body language of someone who has found a conversation they don't want to leave. "People like her," Wade said. It came out with a note of surprise that he heard in himself and didn't love. "Smart people do," Hank said, "and the ones who don't aren't going to matter much longer." He drank his cider. "I was wrong about her." Wade looked at him. Hank did not usually say things like this. Hank said things in the shape of doing them, fixing fence posts, carrying plates, showing up at 6 in the morning with a spade without being asked. The words were different. "You don't have to say it," Wade said. "I know I don't have to," Hank said, which was the same thing he had said about the fence post. "I wrote that advertisement. Capable woman needed for ranch work and household. That was me. I helped you write it." He paused. "I said capable was a sad word." "I remember." "I was wrong about that. Capable is the right word. I just didn't know what capable looked like when I said it." Wade looked at the food table, at Harriet handing a slice of bread to a small girl who had come up tugging at the tablecloth, and watched Harriet crouch down to the girl's level and say something that made the girl laugh. "Neither did I," Wade said. On the way home, with the wagon lighter and the sun angling down toward the ridge, Harriet was quiet. She had talked most of the afternoon, and the quiet was not troubled. It was the quiet of someone who has used a lot of energy well and is now simply resting inside the fact of having done a thing. Wade drove. Deke was in the back of the wagon, half asleep with his hat over his face. After a while, Wade said, "Ruth Draper wants you to come to the schoolroom." Harriet looked up. "For what?" She didn't say specifically. She said something about the women's circle that meets there on Thursdays. She asked if you'd be willing to talk. He paused. "About bread. The garden. I don't know." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "That's the same day I was planning to start the winter mulching. Mulching can wait one Thursday." "Winter can't," she said, but there was something in her voice that was not quite arguing. It was thinking out loud. "What kind of women are in the circle?" "Farm wives, mostly. Some of the ranchers' wives from the north end. Ruth runs it. It started as a reading group." He looked at the road. "Meredith Hollis is not part of it. Too practical for her." Harriet made the small sound she made when she was filing information away. "I'll go," she said. He nodded. "The pie went," she said. "All 3. I noticed. The bread was gone by 2:00. She adjusted her coat. Meredith Hollis didn't say anything else after the tasting. "She said something to Augusta Bowman near the end," Wade said. "I couldn't hear it." "It doesn't matter what she said to Augusta," Harriet said. "What matters is what Augusta Bowman does next time she passes the ranch." She looked at the road ahead. "Augusta is not a bad person. She follows Meredith because it's easier than the alternative. That can change. You're thinking about this like a campaign, he said. I'm thinking about this like a woman who lives here and needs people around her to be able to tolerate her existence, she said. That's not a campaign. That's survival. He drove them around the long bend where the ranch road started, and the pines closed in on both sides the way they did in the evening when the light dropped below the ridge and everything went to deep green and long shadow. Harriet, he said. Today was good, he said. He did not have a better way to say it and did not try to find one. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. It was. Bakam. The following week, two things happened that Harriet had not planned for and Wade had not anticipated. The first was that Meredith Hollis came to the ranch. She came on Tuesday, mid-morning, in her good coat and her expensive hat, arriving in a small buggy that she drove herself, which surprised Wade because he had assumed Meredith Hollis did not drive herself anywhere. She pulled up to the main house and climbed down before he had reached the porch. Mrs. Hollis, he said. Mr. Callaway. She looked at the house. The door was hanging straight now. Hank had reset the hinge the previous Thursday without comment, and the porch board was back and the window patch had been replaced with an actual pane of glass that Harriet had bought in town the second week and installed herself while Wade was out checking the south pasture. I came to speak with Miss Voss. He managed not to look surprised. She's in the kitchen. Meredith Hollis walked into Callaway Ranch for the first time and went to the kitchen, and Wade followed at a distance that he told himself was respectful and was in fact mostly curiosity. Harriet was at the table with her lists, the sourdough crock nearby, and the smell of something baking in the background. She looked up when Meredith came in, and she did not stand, which was either rudeness or confidence, depending on how you measured it. Mrs. Hollis, she said, sit down. Meredith sat. She looked around the kitchen. She looked at the shelves, which were organized now, and at the crock, and at the stove with its new plate, and at the window with its new glass. The gathering was well received, Meredith said, and the cost of those words showed faintly in her jaw. I'm glad, Harriet said. The bread especially. She set her hands in her lap. Several women asked me afterward where you had learned. From my mother mostly, and from doing it badly until I did it less badly. She looked at Meredith directly. Was there something you needed, Mrs. Hollis? Meredith did not like being asked directly. She liked arriving at things gradually, by her own navigation. But Harriet was looking at her with those undeviating brown eyes, and the kitchen was warm, and the something baking in the background smelled extremely good, and all of this created conditions that were not favorable to maneuvering. The church social in November, Meredith said. We do a supper. I'm in charge of the food coordination. She stopped. She began again. I was wondering if you would contribute bread again. The kitchen was quiet. Wade, in the doorway where neither woman was looking at him, pressed his back against the frame and was completely still. Harriet said, What else does the supper need? Meredith looked at her. I beg your pardon? Beyond bread, what else is the supper short on generally? Meredith stared at her for a moment. Then she pulled herself to a kind of order. Desserts, pies go fast, cakes. We always have too much of the savory things and not enough sweet. I'll bring bread and 2 pies, Harriet said. Apple and whatever the cellar offers by November. Meredith sat with this for a moment. Something was moving across her face that was complicated and private and not entirely resolved. And Wade had the feeling he was watching a thing happen in real time that had been a long time building. I said something at the station, Meredith said. She said it the way people say things they have been arguing with themselves about for days. When you arrived. Harriet waited. That was unkind, Meredith said. It was not an apology exactly. It was the shape of one, and Meredith Hollis was a woman who had not had much practice with the shape of apologies, and Harriet could see all of that. Yes, Harriet said. It was. She did not dress it up or wave it away. I appreciate you saying so. The two women looked at each other across the kitchen table, and the moment had its weight, and then it passed, and Meredith stood up. November 12th, she said, 6 o'clock. We'll be there, Harriet said. Meredith left. Wade stepped out of the doorway to let her pass, and she did not acknowledge him having been there, which told him everything about how much energy that visit had required. He walked into the kitchen. Harriet was already back at her lists. "She came here to apologize," he said. "She came here to ask about the November supper," Harriet said. "And she also apologized. Those were two separate things that happened to occur in the same visit." He sat down at the table. "You're not going to make anything of it." "I'm going to bring bread and 2 pies in November," she said. "That's what I'm going to make of it." Sham. The second thing that happened that week was this. Wade came home from checking the north pasture on Wednesday evening to find Harriet sitting on the porch in the last of the light with her coat around her shoulders and nothing in her hands, no paper, no pencil, no work of any kind. He had not seen her without work in her hands since she arrived. He sat down on the step below her. She was looking at the ridge where the pines caught the last of the sun. Her face was doing something it did not usually do during daylight. It was still. Not the stillness of concentration or calculation, just stillness. "You all right?" he said. "My mother died 12 years ago November," she said. She said it the way Harriet Voss said most things, directly, without padding, but without aggression either. "I don't know why November hits harder than the other months." He was quiet. "She had hands that could make anything," Harriet said. "The bread, the garden. She knew soil the way she knew her children, by feel." She looked at her own hands, which were rough now from the garden work. "I learned everything I know from watching her. I never told her that. I meant to." Wade sat on the step with his elbows on his knees and did not say anything useful because there was nothing useful to say, and he knew it. He had learned that from losing Clara, the uselessness of most words in the face of certain kinds of grief, and the strange value of just being nearby while someone else carried the weight of theirs. After a while, Harriet said, "The sourdough is Clara's. The method is my mother's. I think about that sometimes. Something of both of them in the same bread." She paused. "That's probably foolish." "That's not foolish," he said. She looked at the ridge for another moment, and then she stood up and picked up her coat. "I'm going to check on the starter," she said. "Harriet," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you're here," he said. He did not have a more elaborate version of it, and did not try for one. She looked at him for a moment with those direct eyes, and in the fading light, her face had the quality of a person receiving something they had not expected and were not sure what to do with yet. "I'm getting there," she said. It was honest, and it was not cold, and it was exactly the right thing to say because it was true, and he understood it fully. She went inside. He sat on the fixed porch board in the last of the light and looked at the ridge and listened to the sounds of the kitchen coming to life behind him. The creak of the crock lid, the soft sound of feeding the starter, the small domestic industry of a woman who had decided that this place was worth her best effort. And he understood that the ranch was changing not because anyone had declared it changed, but because 2 people were choosing it, every day, in the small, unremarkable ways that actual change requires. The garden was turned, the porch was fixed, the bread was good. And somewhere in the fine balance between those things and the harder things, Wade's silence and his grief, Harriet's distance and her wariness, the space between 2 people who had come to each other practically and were discovering that practical was not simple. Something was being built that had not been there before. It did not have a name yet, but it was holding weight. November came in hard. Not the gradual cooling that September had offered or October's slow dimming. November arrived on a Monday with a wind that had traveled a long way to get there and had not improved its mood in transit. By Tuesday, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the previous week, and by Wednesday morning there was a skin of ice on the water barrel by the barn door, and Deke had to break it with the butt of the axe before the horses could drink. Harriet had been watching the sky since Sunday. She had not said anything about it to Wade directly, but he had noticed her standing at the kitchen window longer than usual, looking north, and he had the sense of someone reading conditions and making calculations that had not yet been spoken. On Wednesday, she came into the main room where Wade was going over the cattle count with Hank, and she said, "The root cellar needs more insulation on the north wall before this weekend." Hank looked up. "It's held every winter for 12 years. "It held when it was maintained," she said. "The packing between the wall boards on the north side is down to nothing in 2 places. I found it last week." She looked at Wade. "If the temperature drops another 10 degrees and stays there, we'll lose the stored vegetables." Hank and Wade exchanged the look of two men being told something they should have known. "I'll do it this afternoon," Hank said. He said it to the table rather than to Harriet, but he said it. "I already bought the material," she said. "It's in the barn." Wade looked at her. "When did you buy material?" "Last Thursday, when I went to town for the sourdough flour." She sat down at the end of the table. "I didn't mention it because I didn't think you'd argue about root vegetable insulation." "I'm not arguing," he said. "Good," she said, "because I also need to talk about the cattle." Hank's chin came up. Cattle were his territory, and he had not hidden that fact. "Not the management of them," Harriet said, reading his face accurately. "The feed storage. The east stack is getting wet from the roof gap. If that hay goes bad in January, we're short." Hank was quiet for a moment. He turned to Wade. "She's right about the roof gap. I've been meaning to—" "Before this weekend," Harriet said. Hank looked at her. He was not a man who appreciated being given a deadline. But he was also, at bottom, an honest man, and the honest answer to the deadline was that she was right about the timing, and he knew it. "Before this weekend," he said. She nodded and got up to go back to the kitchen, and Wade watched her go and then looked at Hank, who was looking at the door she had just passed through with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered in his own kitchen and is still deciding whether to respect it. "She's been in that cellar every week," Hank said. "I know. She knows that ranch better than I thought she would by now." "She knows it better than I do," Wade said. It cost him something to say it, but it was true. And true things had a way of being lighter, once said. The November church supper fell on a Saturday, and the week before it, Harriet baked as she had baked before the harvest gathering, but with the efficiency of someone who had done it once and learned from it. She had the starter going by Monday, adjusted the quantities on Tuesday, baked Thursday and Friday, and by Friday evening the kitchen held 6 loaves and 2 pies, and she was satisfied with all of them except the crust on the second pie, which had gone slightly thick on the east side from the stove's persistent hot spot. "I should have rotated it," she said, looking at it. "It's a pie," Deke said. He was at the table again, which had become a habit, coming in on some pretext and staying because the kitchen had warmth in it that the bunkhouse did not. "Nobody's going to measure the crust." "I'll know," she said. "Is that the apricot or the apple?" "Apple. The apricot's the good one." Deke pulled the apple pie toward him and looked at the thick side. "It's not that bad." "Leave it alone," she said. He pushed it back. "The men at the Sothers place are talking about you," he said, in the tone of someone who has been holding a piece of information and decided it was time to let it out. She turned from the stove. "What men?" "The hired hands. I saw 2 of them at the feed store Wednesday. They said Nella Sothers came home from the harvest gathering and asked their cook why the bread didn't taste like what she'd had at the table." He paused. "Their cook apparently was not pleased." "I'm not trying to make anyone's cook look bad," Harriet said. "You're not trying to do a lot of the things you end up doing," Deke said. She looked at him. It was not a hostile look, but it had something measuring in it. "What does that mean?" she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "It means you walked in here 5 weeks ago with 1 bag, and now the cellar's insulated, and the north fence is fixed, and the garden's mulched for spring. And Hank Brewer said something nice about someone for the first time in my 9 months on this ranch." He set the hat on the table. "I don't think you planned all of it. I think you just do things. And the things add up." She was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the stove. "My mother used to say that a house knows if someone means it well," she said. "I thought that was superstition when I was young." She moved a pot. "I'm less sure now." Deke looked at the pie. "Can I have a piece of the thick crust side, since you don't want it?" "No," she said. "That pie is for the supper." He put his hat back on. Dos. Wade had a harder week than anyone knew. It was not the weather, which was brutal but manageable. It was not the cattle, which were healthy. It was not even the roof gap on the east haystack, which Hank fixed on Thursday with Deke's help, and which turned out to be worse than expected and took most of the day. It was the date. November 14th was the date Clara had died. 3 years ago this November, in the back bedroom of the main house, in a bed that still sat in the same position in the same room, on the 14th. He had not said this to Harriet. He had not said it to anyone because he had not needed to, Hank knew, and Deke probably knew in the way that young men on a ranch absorb facts without being told them directly, and neither of them had ever made anything of the date, which was the right approach. But this year was different because this year there was someone in the house who did not know, and who was moving through the week with her lists and her bread and her practical attention to things. And on the 14th, she came into the kitchen at 4:15 in the morning, the way she always did, and made the coffee, and was already looking at her paper when he came in. And she looked up at him with the same direct look and said, "Good morning," and then looked back at her paper. And he sat down across from her, and she poured the coffee and set it in front of him, and then she stopped. She looked at him for a moment. "Bad night?" she said. He had not slept well, and it showed, and there was no point pretending otherwise. "Some," he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then she looked at the calendar on the wall, the feed store calendar with the month showing, and then she looked back at him. She did not say anything. She got up, went to the shelf, came back with 2 pieces of bread she had cut the night before, and a jar of the apple preserves she had put up in October. She set them in front of him and sat back down. He looked at the bread. Then he looked at her. She was looking at her paper. She had understood the date from the calendar and had decided, in the way she decided most things, that the right response was not a question or a consolation or an expression of feeling she had not been asked for, but bread, which was solid and warm and present and asked nothing. He ate the bread. He drank the coffee. She worked on her list. After a while he said, 3 years ago today. "I know," she said. "She was sick 4 days." "You told me," she said, quietly, without looking up. This year is harder than the other 2. He did not know exactly why that was true. He suspected it had something to do with the kitchen smelling like bread again, and the porch being fixed, and the cellar being tended, and all the ways the house had come back to life, because each thing that returned also marked its absence in the years between. Harriet set down her pencil. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the porch the evening she talked about her mother, not with softness exactly, but without the usual practical distance. "When my mother died," she said, "the second year was the worst. The first year I was busy with the grief itself. The second year I'd had time to think about what I'd lost, and I kept finding more of it in unexpected places." She paused. "A third year that feels harder might mean the same thing. You're finding more." He looked at the table. "The house is different now, since you came." "Yes," she said. "It's better. I mean that is a good thing, but it also means—" He stopped. He did not have the language for this, and he was a man who had never developed much vocabulary for the interior, and he was frustrated with himself for having started a sentence he didn't know how to finish. "It means the house being alive again makes you feel what it was to have it not be," Harriet said. He looked up at her. "Yes," he said. She picked up her pencil. "That's not a bad problem to have," she said, "compared to the alternative." He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind was going at the north side of the house with a steady low note, the kind of November wind that doesn't rage but simply persists. "She would have liked you," he said. He didn't know why he said it, and he couldn't take it back, and he found he didn't want to. Harriet was quiet for a moment. "I would have liked knowing her recipe for the garden soil," she said finally. "Hank says she had a method for the composting." It was not what he had expected her to say. It was also exactly the right thing. She had taken the weight of it and held it and then set it somewhere manageable. "I'll ask Hank," he said. "I already did," she said. "He's going to show me in the spring." So the church supper was everything the harvest gathering had been, and different in the specific ways that indoor November events differ from outdoor October ones. Warmer, closer, louder, with the kind of noise that comes from people who have been mostly indoors for a week and are glad for company. Harriet came in with the bread, and Wade carried the pies, and they set up their end of the table the same way as before. Bread first, then pies, the good apricot visible, and the apple with its slightly thick east crust turned to face the back. Augusta Bowman was at the table when they arrived. She looked at the bread. She looked at Harriet. "I was hoping you'd bring the sourdough," she said. "Just that. No performance, no layering." "It's what I have," Harriet said. Augusta smiled, a small, genuine thing, without any of the complicated social architecture of the harvest gathering. "Save me an end piece?" Done, Harriet said. That was all. But it was different from everything Augusta Bowman had said to Harriet in every previous encounter, and they both knew it, and neither made anything of it because making something of it would have required acknowledging what it replaced, and that was a conversation neither of them needed. Meredith Hollis arrived punctually, organized the seating arrangement, distributed the candles on the tables, and managed the supper with the efficiency of someone who was very good at this particular thing and had built her social position on being very good at it. She was pleasant to Harriet in the way that required effort and therefore meant something, and Harriet received it in the way that Harriet received most things, without making it larger or smaller than it was. Ruth Draper found her after the eating was done, when people were milling and the table was being cleared. "The circle," Ruth said. "You're still coming Thursday?" "I said I'd come," Harriet said. "You've been busy." "I said I'd come," Harriet said again. Ruth smiled. She was a tall woman, plain-spoken, who had the manner of someone who had been underestimated herself at some point and had decided to stop being surprised by it in others. "I want you to talk about the garden," she said. "3 women in the circle have ground they can't get to cooperate, and I think you know things that would help." "I know what worked for me," Harriet said. "I don't know if it'll translate." "That's exactly what I want you to say to them," Ruth said. "Not a lecture. Just what you know." Harriet looked at her. "You've been organizing this for a while." "Since the harvest gathering," Ruth said without apology. "I saw how Nella Suthurst looked at you after the pie. I thought, this woman has something to give, and people around here are stubborn about receiving things from strangers. If I can make the context right, you're managing me," Harriet said. Ruth tilted her head. "I'm making an introduction," she said, "between what you know and the people who need it. That's different from managing." Harriet thought about this. It was, she decided, a fine distinction, but a real one. "Thursday," she said. 2 hours. 2 hours, Ruth agreed. Wade had been watching this exchange from across the room with a kind of careful attention that he was only half aware of having. He had been doing that more in the past few weeks, watching Harriet navigate rooms the way he used to watch Clara navigate them, with the particular interest of a man who knows he is not naturally good at social terrain and respects someone who is. Clara had been warm and easy. She made rooms comfortable by the force of her personality, the way certain people just have weather around them. Harriet was different. She did not warm the room. She leveled it. She entered a social situation the way she entered the cellar, with a lamp and an inventory list, and came out knowing what was there and what was needed. He was thinking about this on the drive home, with Deke in the back of the wagon and Harriet beside him on the bench, when she said, "You went quiet." "Thinking," he said. "About what?" He considered whether to say it and decided he might as well. "About how you handle people. You're different from—" He stopped. "From Clara," she said. Not accusatory, factual. "She made people feel comfortable," he said. "You make them feel reckoned with." Harriet thought about this for a moment. The wagon moved through the dark and the cold, and Garnet picked her steady, opinionated pace. "I don't know how to make people comfortable," Harriet said. "I never learned it. My mother could do it. I watched her do it my whole childhood, and I still don't have the knack." She paused. "What I can do is take people seriously, give them the honest answer, not pretend the hard thing isn't there." She looked at the road ahead. "Some people find that comfortable eventually, some never do." "Meredith Hollis is coming around," he said. "Meredith Hollis respects competence," Harriet said. "She always has. She just needed to see mine without the cover story she'd already written." He drove. He thought about that. "What's the cover story she wrote?" he said. "That I'm what the advertisement produced," Harriet said. "A plain woman who came because no better option presented itself, and who will run a minimal house for a widowed rancher and disappear into the geography." She paused. "That's not an unreasonable story, given the information she had. It just happens to be wrong." He glanced at her sideways. "You knew she had that story." "I'd have the same story if the positions were reversed," she said. "A woman who answers a mail advertisement in a newspaper is either courageous or desperate, and from the outside you can't tell which. I had to make it clear which one I was." She pulled her coat tighter. The bread helped. He said, "It was good bread." "It's getting better," she said. "By spring, the starter will be fully what it should be. Another feeding cycle or two." He thought about spring. He thought about the garden, turned and mulched, waiting under the frozen ground for the temperature to change. He thought about the apple trees in the south corner and whether there were any others on the property worth trying to revive. "I've been thinking about the property line on the south end," he said. "There's a stretch I've never used. It gets enough sun." "Orchard?" she said. He had not used that word even to himself. He turned it over. "Maybe. Eventually." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's a 10-year project." "I know," he said. She looked at him. In the dark of the wagon road, he couldn't see her face clearly, but he felt the look. He felt the weight of what they were both understanding. That a 10-year project required a 10-year commitment, and he had said it without qualifying it, and she had heard it without misunderstanding it. "The soil on the south end is different," she said, after a moment. "Sandier. I looked at it in October. We'd need to amend it heavily before anything would take." "You already looked at it," he said. "I look at all of it," she said. "It's my place." There it was again, the same thing she had said in the wagon on the way home from their first town trip. Not a declaration, not a sentiment, just a fact. This is where I live, and I take it seriously. And the second time felt different from the first because there were 6 weeks of living inside it now. And the sourdough was fed, and the cellar was insulated, and the garden was ready for spring, and somewhere in the south corner there was land she had already been thinking about. In December, the first hard snow came. It came on a Tuesday night quietly, and by Wednesday morning the ranch was under 8 inches with more falling and the kind of silence that deep snow brings, which is a complete silence, the absence of all the small sounds you don't know you are hearing until they are gone. Harriet was up before the snow stopped. Wade found her in the kitchen at 4 with a pot of something heavy going on the stove, a thick soup with the salt pork and the dried beans and the root vegetables from the cellar, onions cooked down, everything slow. "Snow day," she said. "Hearty food." "You started at 4, he said. "It needs time," she said. 3 hours at least." He got his coffee and sat down. Through the window the snow was still falling, slow and steady, the gray pre-dawn light turning everything the color of paper. Hank came in at 5 with snow on his coat and his hat and his boots. He stood in the kitchen doorway and smelled the soup. He took off his hat. "How are the cattle?" Wade said. "Moved to the south shelter last night," Hank said. "I did it before dark when I saw it coming." He looked at Harriet. "There's enough hay." "Enough for 2 weeks if it stays cold," she said, without turning around. "The east stack is dry. I checked it after you fixed the roof." Hank hung his coat. He sat down at the table. He said, "You checked it after I fixed it." "I trust your work," she said. "I wanted to know the quantity." Hank looked at Wade. Wade looked at his coffee. "The quantity is enough," Hank said. "I know," she said. "I said I checked it." Deke came in at 6, also snow-covered, and stood in the doorway in the same posture as every morning, uncertain whether to stay or go, and Harriet pointed at the chair without looking at him, and he sat down. They ate breakfast at 7. 4 people around a table that had once held one, or 1.5 if you counted the fact that Wade had spent the first years after Clara's death eating in the posture of a man trying to take up as little space as possible. Harriet had made biscuits from the morning's flour, and the soup was thick and correct, and outside the snow was coming down in the particular Colorado way that means it is not finished yet. And inside the kitchen, the lamp was on and the stove was going, and it was warm. Hank ate 2 bowls of soup. This was unremarkable except that he had been a 1-bowl man his entire time on the ranch. He noticed Deke noticing. "The cold," he said gruffly. "Sure," Deke said. After breakfast, when the 2 men had gone back out to check on the animals, and Wade was getting his gear on to go with them, Harriet said, "Wade." He turned. She was at the table with her paper, her pencil moving. She did not look up. "The South Orchard land," she said. "In spring, when the ground is workable. I'd like to start amending it." He stood in the doorway with his coat half on. "That's not nothing," he said. "That's real work." "I know what it is," she said, and looked up. "Do you want me to do it?" He looked at her across the kitchen. At the woman who had arrived with one bag and fixed the stove and revived the starter and turned the garden and insulated the cellar and made the bread that people in Caldwell Flats were still talking about. And he thought about the advertisement he had written that said capable and the answer that had come back that said practical and how far both of them had fallen short of the actual thing. "Yes," he said. She looked back at her paper. He went out into the snow. It was Hank who finally said the thing out loud, and he said it not to Wade but to Deke on a Thursday afternoon in the barn when they were working on a broken harness and the main house was visible through the barn door across the yard. He said, "She's what the ranch needed." Deke looked up from the harness. "Not just the cooking," Hank said. He was not looking at Deke. He was working the leather. Not just the garden, the whole... She sees it. She looks at this place and she sees what it is and what it could be, and she doesn't flinch from either. He paused. Clara was a good woman. This one is a different kind of good. Deke worked the harness for a moment. "You gonna tell Wade that?" "Wade knows it," Hank said. "He's just still figuring out what to do with knowing it." That was accurate. Wade knew it. He was figuring out what to do with it in the way he figured out most things that did not have a practical solution. Slowly, without forcing it, the way you wait for ground to thaw. The answer would come. The ground always thawed. The ground thawed in late March. Not all at once. Nothing in Colorado thawed all at once. But in the way that real thaws happened, which was unevenly and with setbacks, a warm week followed by a cold snap, followed by 3 days of rain that turned everything to mud before the sun came back and dried the top inch, while the lower ground was still working its way loose. Harriet had been watching for it since February. She knew the signs from her father's farm, the particular give underfoot near the south fence, the way water stopped pooling on the surface and began to disappear into the earth instead of sitting on top of it. She started on the south orchard land the first Monday in April. Wade came out at noon and found her with the large fork turned up from the root garden, working the sandy soil of the south end in the methodical way she worked everything, starting from the outside edge and moving inward, no wasted motion, no rushed patches. She had a wheelbarrow beside her with compost from the pile she had been building since October, layering kitchen scraps and dried garden material and the old hay bedding from the barn into a slow, dark transformation that was now ready to go into the ground. He stood at the edge and looked at what she had turned in a morning. It was not a small amount. "You should have told me you were starting today," he said. "I did," she said. "Monday." "I said Monday." He thought back. She had said Monday at the dinner table on Thursday, and he had been thinking about the south fence and had heard it but not recorded it, which was a different thing. "I forgot," he said. "I know," she said. He went to the barn and got the other fork. They worked through the afternoon, talking sometimes and not talking other times, in the rhythm they had developed over the winter, a rhythm that was one of the things that had grown up between them without announcement, like the compost pile, from small daily accumulations. Wade had started asking her questions about the soil, and she had started asking him questions about the cattle, and somewhere in the middle of that exchange of ignorances, they had built a working language for the ranch that neither of them had alone. Deke came by at 3 with a question about a water line and ended up staying to help turn the east section. He did not ask permission. He got a shovel from the barn and came back and started digging, and Harriet looked at him once and went back to her row. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. This was, Wade noticed, something everyone on this ranch had started saying in the place where other people might say thank you. And he had a feeling it had started with Harriet, who used the phrase herself in situations where other people might beg or demand, and it had spread to the others the way certain phrases spread when they land in exactly the right place. By evening, they had turned and amended half the south plot. It was not finished and would not be finished that week, but the beginning of an orchard was visible in the turned earth, which is the stage when something shifts from idea to fact. Spring on the ranch was different from the springs Wade had managed alone. Not easier. If anything, there was more happening, more decisions, more things in motion at once. The garden was coming back, which required attention. The cattle were calving, which required more. The north fence needed its annual assessment, and there were 2 more posts that hadn't survived the winter. The well needed the casing inspected before the dry months. but different in the way that a coordinated thing is different from a solo thing. Not less work, but work that had a shape to it, a direction, because there were now two people thinking about the ranch instead of one, and they thought about it differently, and the difference was useful. Harriet managed the house and the garden and had taken on the supply accounting, which meant she knew what the ranch was spending and on what. And in February, she had shown Wade a column of numbers that demonstrated they had spent 30% less on dry goods since October than in the equivalent months of the previous year because the cellar was properly stocked and managed. He had looked at the numbers for a long moment. "I didn't track this before," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you want me to keep tracking it?" "Yes," he said. That was another thing about Harriet. She did not perform the finding of a problem. She found it, addressed it, showed you the result, and waited to see what you wanted to do next. There was no drama in the presentation, just the numbers. The cattle operation remained primarily Hank's territory, which was right. Hank knew cattle the way Harriet knew soil, from the ground up, and no amount of Harriet's organizational intelligence would substitute for that specific accumulated knowledge. But she had started asking Hank questions in the evenings, at the table, about the rotation schedule and the calving records, and Hank had started answering them with the gradual expansion of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to find his expertise interesting. "She's going to know this whole operation inside a year," Hank said to Wade one morning in the barn. He did not sound displeased about this. "She knows most of it already," Wade said. "The part she doesn't know is the cattle history," Hank said. "I'm teaching her." "I noticed," Wade said. "She asks good questions," Hank said. He went back to the grain scoop. "Doesn't ask stupid things twice, takes notes." Wade thought about the paper. There was always paper, always a pencil, always the small, precise handwriting accumulating information in the margins. He had started thinking of it as her second memory, the first memory being the one in her head, which was considerable, and the second being the paper record she kept in case the first one needed verification. They were not yet married in the legal sense. This was a fact that Caldwell Flats had been navigating with varying degrees of comfort since October, when it became clear that Harriet Voss was running the Callaway household and had no immediate plans to be otherwise labeled. Some people were bothered by this and said so to each other. Some were not bothered and said nothing. Ruth Draper, at the Thursday Circle, had said privately to two women who asked that what happened inside a working ranch between two adults who were clearly building something together was exactly no one's business but theirs, and that had settled the matter for most of the circle. Meredith Hollis had not raised the subject. This was noticed. What was also noticed, and talked about more quietly, in the way that real social change gets talked about before it becomes the official version, was that Harriet had come to 3 Thursday Circles now, and at each one she had talked about what she knew with the same directness she brought to everything, and women had left with information they were going to use, and 2 of them had already started their own sourdough starters from a piece of Harriet's, which meant Clara Callaway's sourdough was now living in 3 houses in Caldwell Flats and the surrounding county, which was a kind of propagation that had nothing to do with bread. Ruth had said this to Harriet on a Thursday in April while they were stacking chairs after the circle. "You know what you're actually doing here," Ruth said. "It's not about bread." Harriet stacked a chair. "What is it about?" "You're telling women that knowing practical things is worth something," Ruth said. "That the knowledge you get from running a farm and a kitchen and keeping things alive, that it has value, not as a replacement for other kinds of knowing, just as its own kind, legitimate." She paused. "A lot of these women haven't heard that from anyone." Harriet was quiet for a moment. She stacked another chair. "My mother knew everything about the soil and the house and the animals," she said. "She could read weather, and she could diagnose a sick plant, and she could feed 15 people from a near-empty pantry. Nobody ever called that intelligence." She straightened up. "It was just what women did. Invisible." "Yes," Ruth said. "It's not invisible," Harriet said. "It came out flat and certain." "No," Ruth agreed. "It's not." They stacked the rest of the chairs and walked out into the April afternoon, and Harriet rode home with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has said a thing they have been needing to say for a long time and found that the saying of it did not make it smaller. Wade asked her to marry him on a Wednesday evening in May. This is not precisely accurate. What actually happened was more complicated and less ceremonial, which was appropriate for two people who had been conducting their lives in a practical rather than ceremonial register since the day they met. They were in the South Orchard plot, which was now fully amended and had in it 12 young apple whips that a nurseryman from the next county had brought out the previous week, small, barely rooted things that looked optimistic and fragile in the turned soil, staked against the wind. Harriet was checking the stakes. Wade was 2 rows over, doing the same. He said without particular preamble, "I'd like us to get married." She did not stop checking the stakes she was checking. "All right," she said. He looked over at her. "That's it? What else do you want me to say?" He thought about this. He had not planned a speech and was glad he hadn't, given the circumstances, but he had expected some kind of response beyond all right. "Something," he said, "about it." She straightened up and looked at him across 2 rows of apple whips. The evening light was in her face and she looked the way she always looked, direct, composed, attending to the thing in front of her. "I came here with 1 bag," she said, "thinking I might last 6 months if we suited each other well enough to make a go of it. I stayed because I want to be here. Because the work is real and the people are honest and the land is worth the trouble." She paused. "I would have told you if I'd decided otherwise." "That's not exactly a declaration," he said. "Wade." She said his name with the weight she always gave it, which was not dramatic but was solid. "I fed your sourdough starter every day for 7 months. I planted garlic in October in ground that hadn't been touched in 4 years. I started an orchard that won't produce anything worth eating for 3 years at minimum." She looked at the apple whips. "What did you think that was?" He stood in the South Orchard plot in the May evening and looked at the 12 small trees and the turned ground and the woman who had, he now understood, been answering his question every day for 7 months in the only language she reliably used, which was the language of sustained, deliberate effort toward something worth having. "I think I was slow," he said. "You were," she said, "but you got there." He walked over to her row. He was not a man who did things gracefully. He had never been, and this was not the occasion that would change it. So he walked over and stood in front of her and said, "I was wrong about you. When you stepped off that stagecoach, I thought—" "I know what you thought," she said. "I thought the wrong woman had come," he said. "I want to say that. I want you to hear me say it out loud." He looked at her. "I was wrong. You were exactly right. You were the only right answer to what this ranch needed and what I needed, and I didn't have the sense to see it." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face. Not a crack in it exactly, but a softening, the kind that comes when a person who has been holding themselves at a measured distance allows a small, real thing through. "I know," she said, "but thank you for saying it." She put her hand out. He took it. They stood in the South Orchard in the May evening with their hands joined and 12 small apple trees between them and the ranch behind them, going about its business of being a living thing, which it was, again, unmistakably, and had been since the first evening in October when the smell of bread moved through its walls. They were married at the beginning of June in the county clerk's office in Caldwell Flats, with Hank and Deke as witnesses, and Ruth Draper, who had come because Harriet had asked her, standing to the left of the clerk's desk with her coat still on because the clerk's office was cold. It took 11 minutes. The clerk read the words. Wade and Harriet said the words. Hank signed his name with the pen grip of a man who did not sign documents often. Deke signed with the eagerness of someone who had been waiting for this particular thing to become official since approximately the second week of October. Outside the clerk's office, on the wooden sidewalk of Caldwell Flats, Ruth Draper hugged Harriet with the firmness of a woman who had decided to do it and was not going to be diffident about it. Harriet, who was not generally a person to whom being hugged came naturally, stood inside the embrace for a moment and then put her arms around Ruth and held on for exactly as long as it was right to hold on. When they separated, Ruth looked at her and said, "You're good for all of us, not just the ranch." Harriet said, Give me another year and I'll have 3 more women growing their own garlic. 4, Ruth said. Augusta Bowman asked me about it last week. Harriet looked at her. Something crossed her face that was close to satisfied. Augusta Bowman, she said. Augusta Bowman, Ruth confirmed. Harriet looked across the street at the dry goods store where Garrett Peel was moving something in the window, and at the small square of Caldwell Flats with its wooden buildings and its winter-worn street and its complicated humans, and she thought about arriving here in September with one bag and every person on that station platform having already decided what she was. She had not come here to prove them wrong. She had come here because it was a practical option for a woman in a practical situation. She had stayed because it became worth staying for. The proving wrong had been incidental, a byproduct of simply being herself, consistently, without softening or inflating it for any audience. That, she thought, was the only kind of proving worth doing. By the end of the summer, the Callaway Ranch had a different reputation in the county than it had held the September before. This had happened through the accumulation of specific facts rather than any announcement. The facts were these. The cattle count was up by 9 head from careful management over the winter. The garden had produced enough in spring to fill the cellar past its previous watermark and provide surplus that Harriet had traded at the Caldwell Flats dry goods store for credit. The sourdough starter, which had come back from near death in a dark crock in October, was now feeding bread in 4 households. The south orchard had 12 apple trees in the ground. The root cellar was organized and documented in the small, precise handwriting that had become, on the ranch, a kind of infrastructure. Hank had stopped calling her Miss Voss in February. He had started calling her Harriet in the way he had started doing other things, without announcement, without any particular moment, simply because the previous way no longer fit, and he was an honest enough man to adjust to what fit. Deke had asked her in June if she would write down the bread recipe. She had told him the bread was not a recipe, it was a relationship with a living thing, and you couldn't write it down any more than you could write down how to be a parent. You could describe the method, but the understanding came from doing it and failing and doing it again. He had looked at her with the expression of someone receiving information that is larger than the question they asked. So you have to actually do it, he said. Everything worth knowing requires that, she said. The method is just the map. You still have to walk it yourself. He had thought about this for longer than she expected. Then he had said, "Could you teach me? Not to write down, just to do." She had looked at him with the particular look she gave things she was deciding to take seriously. "Wednesday mornings," she said, "starting at 5. He had shown up the first Wednesday at 4:50, which told her everything about whether he was serious. On an evening in late August, with the light going long and golden the way August light went in Colorado, Wade came home from checking the south fence to find Harriet on the porch. This had become, over the year, a pattern. The porch in the evenings, when the day's work was done enough to pause without guilt. She had the mending in her lap, which was not the basket of mending she had inherited in October, that had been completed and replaced twice over by the ordinary wear of ranch life. But it was the same basket, and she worked on it with the same focused efficiency. He sat on the step below her. "South fence is holding," he said. "Good," she said. The ranch was quiet around them in the particular way of late August evenings. The cattle settled, the horses in, the birds finishing up their last considerations of the day. From the kitchen behind them came the faint living smell of the sourdough starter that had been on the back shelf since October, fed and tended, altered by seasons of use and yet continuous, the same thing it had been. "I've been thinking about next year," he said. "The orchard," she said, "and the north pasture. If we improve the water line, we could run more head." She set down the mending. "That's a 2-year project, the line and the improvement together." "I know." She looked at the ridge where the pines were still green against the September coming sky. "We could start the planning this winter. Work backward from what we need." "That's what I was thinking," he said. They sat in the evening with the ranch around them, and the future arranged in its imperfect and promising shape, and Wade thought about the advertisement he had written the previous fall. Those few plain words about a capable woman wanted, and understood that what you asked for was almost never adequate to what you actually needed, and that the gap between the two was where most of life happened. He had asked for capable. He had received someone who was capable, yes, and also stubborn and direct and occasionally infuriating and possessed of a certainty about soil and bread and the worth of practical knowledge that she did not soften for anyone's comfort. Someone who had sat in his kitchen on the 14th of November and not asked him a single question and put bread in front of him instead. Someone who had told Meredith Hollis's social architecture the truth until the architecture adjusted. Someone who had fed a nearly dead sourdough starter back to life because, as she had said, it was a waste to let a good thing die when it didn't have to. "Harriet," he said. She picked up the mending again. He did not know what he had started to say. He found, sitting there, that the things that mattered most were already spoken in the life they were living. In the garden and the cellar and the 12 small trees in the south plot, and the bread cooling on the kitchen shelf, and the fact that when he came home each evening, the house had the quality of a place where someone had been working toward it all day. He had spent 3 years in a house that felt like something interrupted. He had not known how much that cost until it stopped. "Nothing," he said. "Just your name." She looked at him sideways. "You stopped in the middle of a thought." "I didn't have a thought. Just—" He stopped. "It's good," he said. "This." She looked at him with those direct brown eyes that had looked at him directly from the moment she stepped off the stagecoach and had never looked away from anything hard or true since. "Yes," she said, "it is." She went back to the mending. He stayed on the step. The evening light moved across the ranch in its slow September angle, catching the garden and the fixed porch boards and the window with its new glass. And somewhere in the back of the south corner, 12 young trees stood in the amended ground and held their first summer behind them and waited for whatever was next. The sourdough on the back shelf was ready for tomorrow's bread. The cellar was stocked. The fence was holding. It was not a perfect life. The north fence would need attention again in spring. The cattle market was uncertain. The orchard would not produce for 2 more years and might lose a tree or two to the winter before it did. Wade still had mornings in November when the weight of November was specific and old. Harriet still had evenings when she sat with her mending and was somewhere else entirely, somewhere back in Iowa or somewhere that had no address at all. But they were both here, choosing to be here. Every day making the small, unremarkable choices, the bread, the garden, the accounts, the question about the water line and the answer about the soil, that added up, over time, to a life built, rather than simply inhabited. That is, in the end, what the ranch had needed. Not rescue, not dramatic transformation. Just 2 imperfect people who decided to mean it, and kept deciding, morning after morning, in the kitchen where the lamp made its circle of light, and the sourdough was alive and the coffee was ready, and there was always something worth doing next.